welcome to Tea and Strumpets, a Regency romance review. I'm Zoe.
And I'm Kelsey. Zoe, it's that time of year again. What time of year is it?
It's my birthday.
Woohoo!
Yes, very exciting. Hasn't happened very many times. I'm very, very young. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, this year I will be 29 with 3 years of experience. So, you know.
It's a good year.
It is a good year.
Are you doing anything fun?
I was planning on it, and I am now thinking that perhaps the thing I really want to do is nothing. So we will see.
Perfect. That sounds fabulous.
Yeah, the weekend is on its way, and perhaps I will rally some friends for a game night, but perhaps I will also just enjoy a night in.
You know what? That's fantastic. And sometimes it's just nice to just have a nice dinner, whether it's made or you go out. It's just like, for me, that's always a nice celebration. You celebrate with food.
Mm-hmm.
That's my own personal thing.
Yeah.
But just take a minute to relax and enjoy your food and enjoy your wine with your food. Fabulous.
Yeah, I can't really ask for much more. Maybe some, food-related things. Like I could go for some tamales. That sounds really delicious to me.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see what the cards bring. My actual birthday is the day before this episode comes out. But of course, we are recording before that. So I'm looking forward to it. I think birthdays are fun and special.
Yay. I think so too. I love celebrating birthdays. So expect something in the mail.
Aw. But maybe I'll also be getting myself a good book. And we read a book today, and we're here to talk about that book. But before we jump into that, I have a question for you, Kelsey.
Hit me with it.
So it's the start of a new year. What is on the top of your to-be-read pile?
All right. So on the top of my to-be-read pile is actually one for my other book club, so my other quote-unquote required reading, and that is Unveiled by Courtney Milan.
Oh my gosh, you're so lucky. I can't remember which one that is, but if it's the one I'm thinking about, I mean, I love that whole series, but like, if that's the one I'm thinking about, oh, Kelsey, you lucky.
All right, yeah, so I'm very excited because I realized I have not actually read a ton of Courtney Milan, so I'm very excited to get started on this one.
Well, happy reading. And for me, I also have a book club book on the top of my to-be-read pile. And that book is The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics by Olivia Waite.
Ooh, you were very excited about the new sequel that's coming out soon.
I sure am. And this is a female-female romance, so it leads us pretty well into the book that we're talking about today, which is a male-male Regency romance, and it is called The Soldier's Scoundrel, and it is by Cat Sebastian. And we are going to be doing our usual format today, but we're also going to be joined by some special guests after we do our synopsis to talk about the book. So I'm really excited to get to that. But we're going to start off, as we always do, with our author facts this week. And since this is our first Cat Sebastian book, we're starting with her plain old Goodreads bio.
Can't go wrong with that.
Exactly. Cat writes steamy, upbeat historical romances. They usually take place in the Regency, generally have at least one LGBTQ plus main character, and they always have happy endings. Before writing, Kat was a lawyer and a teacher. She enjoys crossword puzzles, geeking out over birds. Me too, Kat. Gardening badly. Also me too, Kat. And of course, reading.
You don't garden badly.
Okay, but my husband gardens better than me. I would be nothing without him.
That's fair. I'm only in charge of the houseplants.
I don't even have any of those. I can't keep them alive. So anyhow, in high school, her parents went away for a week, and instead of throwing raucous parties, Kat read Middlemarch. Even worse, Kat remembers little of a trip through Europe because she was busy reading Mansfield Park. Her proudest moment was when she realized her kids were shaping up to be hopeless bookworms too. And currently, her favorite genres are romance, mystery, and fantasy.
I like all those genres too.
Agreed. And today, she lives with her husband, 3 kids, and a dog in an improbably small house. After growing up in the Northeast, she now lives in a part of the South where every body of water seems to contain alligators or sharks, and every restaurant serves biscuits and gravy. She likes the biscuits, but not so much the alligators.
That's fair. And I will say that's one thing about the South is there's predators in the water. And I like being by the water, but I'm very spoiled in my California life where, like, the ocean's too cold. So, like, I'm not going to have to worry about the sharks.
Absolutely true. I'm the same way, but I have other problems with sea creatures that we don't have enough time to unpack here today. But we are going to be talking about some history facts, aren't we, Kelsey?
We are. And in fact, we have quite a few history facts this week, all along the same train of thought. So we're going to talk about the dangers of being a queer person in the past. And then we'll get to how love triumphs in the book we read today.
So the stakes were so much higher for queer people back then, right? In this time period, it's not a ruined reputation or becoming a social pariah. If they have a quote unquote scandal, it's possibly losing their life and affecting the loved ones around them in a lot more serious way. So I think that reviewing all of the things that we've done in the past, it's just really important to not forget that that's where we came from and that we fought for where we're at today.
Exactly. So we are going to start all the way back in 1533 with Henry VIII, because he passed the Buggery Act, which basically sentenced those found guilty of unnatural sexual act against the will of God and man to death. So in theory, this was usually how they referred to anal sex or bestiality. And in practice, it basically meant any sexual act between two men. And at first, the law was kind of barely applied. Really, not a lot of people were sentenced to death at 150 years. However, as English society became more conservative, it definitely ramped up the amount of deaths that were done per year and people accused of this act. Also, we want to jump across the pond and talk about France. So France, as we know, has always kind of been seen as, especially like Paris and the capital, is always seen as a bit more sexually freeing, and apparently not just for straight couples, but also for queer people as well, because the French decriminalized sodomy in 1791, and when Napoleon created the new penal code of 1810, he didn't include any laws about sodomy. He kind of left that law alone. They'd already banned it, so he said, okay, it's out, so it's out. So it really became a hot spot for homosexual and transgender individuals.
Now, we've talked mostly about men, but we haven't talked much about gay women, and that's because details about life as a queer woman during this time period are scarce. And romantic relationships between women were, and still often are, misconstrued as passionate friendships. So in cases where such friendships were discovered to have a sexual nature to them, legal action was typically not pursued against the offender. So there are some famous cases of this, and one I'm going to mention is the ladies of Llangollen, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing Llangollen.
Welsh is a hard language.
It is. So these two ladies, Eleanor and Sarah, had a romantic relationship for over 50 years. They defied their families and established an estate in Wales rather than enter into marriages with men that they didn't love. And though they incurred significant debt in order to have a staff, they ended up surviving on the generosity of friends until a fascinated Queen Charlotte convinced King George III to grant them a pension. And there is so much more about them, and they are well talked about anywhere you want to find them. But I highly recommend the Stuff You Missed in History class episode about them, and we're going to link to that in the show notes so you can learn more about the ladies of Llangollen.
Yes, I highly recommend you do so.
So we have a few different tropes in this one. We have a difference of class. We have a gentleman and a working class. Mm-hmm. And we've got a hero who is absolutely adamant that he cannot fall in love. We also have a mystery afoot, and our heroes are traveling alone together.
Well, lots of things happen when you travel.
It's so true. It's great.
Yes. So today our main characters are Jack Turner and the former Honorable Captain Oliver Rivington, who is the son of an earl.
Correct. And now he's just Mr. Rivington as he has sold his commission and returned to England.
Yes.
So, Kelsey, shall we get into it?
We shall. We are going to start with Jack Turner, who is working in his modest office above his sister's dress shop when she alerts him that a gentleman has come to see him. Now, Jack doesn't usually take gentlemen as clients. In fact, he has a rule not to. But his sister has already sent him up, so he kind of has to talk to them.
Yeah, his sister has a client downstairs and she doesn't want to make a scene, and she says that Jack can take care of his own business. So the man in question enters with a limp and a cane and a stunningly handsome visage, one that Jack actually recognizes. It is Captain Rivington, who Jack greets by name and then is asked by Rivington himself, "Have we met?" And Jack replies with a frustratingly vague, "Not exactly."
Because Jack really can't say that the last time he saw Rivington, he was having an affair with another man in the orangery of his father's house.
Yes.
But that image has stuck with Jack and has actually been an object of few of his daydreams. However, Rivington isn't there to hire Jack. Actually, he would like to know why Jack is being paid £200 by his sister, Lady Montbray. And he can already tell that Jack is unsavory and really wants to know what sort of business his sister has with him, because obviously it must not be good, and therefore Jack needs to knock it off immediately.
So Jack, of course, though, won't tell Rivington what he does because part of his business is being discreet. And at this moment, though, their quarrel is paused because another client has come to call. And as Rivington refuses to leave, Jack decides that, well, perhaps it's best if Rivington watches him question a new client. Perhaps he'll get enough information and enough of an idea of what Jack does that he'll fill in the gaps and leave Jack alone. So Rivington sits in a shadowy chair in the corner and is introduced as his associate as Jack meets with Mrs. Wraxall, a prospective client.
So she has come with a conundrum. She has kept some old, slightly incriminating letters of an affair she had before she was married, and she kept them in her jewel box, which recently she found them missing. And she says that she found a blackmail note and is awaiting further instructions. But she's beside herself, and she heard of Jack from her maid, and so she has requested that Jack find the letters.
And the blackmail letter, for whatever reason, she had decided to burn, so she doesn't have that anymore. But meanwhile, Rivington's sitting in the corner, and he is not sure what to make of Mr. Turner. He realizes that Mr. Turner is a gruff sort who seems to take the law into his own hands, which for Rivington, who's just come back from many years of serving in the war, he can't quite abide with that. But of course, he's also extremely alluring as well, and somehow Jack seems concerned for Rivington's limp and his pain, which is an unwelcome distraction to Rivington. And while he doesn't approve of Mr. Turner's practices, this he knows, he does feel a serious kinship with Mrs. Wraxall's plight. So she says, quote, "We had a secret location. It was a place where we met." Color rose into Mrs. Wraxall's pale cheeks, and Oliver felt his own cheeks flush in sympathy and mortification. He was no stranger to illicit rendezvous, and it was only by the grace of God that he had never been caught out. Now he felt worse that this lady was desperate enough to go to a scoundrel like Turner.
But in the end, Rivington really just can't stomach Turner's practices. And, quote, "I'm sure Miss Wilkins explained my terms to you, and it bears repeating. I am not a Bow Street runner, nor am I a magistrate." He spoke with the air of one who had delivered the same speech too many times to remember. "I solve my client's problem in the way I deem best. I won't ask for your approval before acting, and I won't keep you appraised of my progress. It may come to pass that I won't tell you who took your letters or why. You pay me, I make the problem disappear, and that's the end of our arrangement. If you have any misgivings, I'll throw my notes on the fire and we'll pretend this never happened." So Rivington can't stand it because Jack's just acting outside the law. He's just doing whatever the hell he feels like, and he's not even looking for client approval. He's just doing whatever the hell he feels like doing in order to make a problem disappear. And Rivington cannot stand that.
Correct. And therefore, Jack was sadly mistaken that having Rivington stay and watch him with a client would ease his mind. So once Mrs. Wraxall leaves, Oliver tells Jack that he's just getting started with him. And they begin to argue and banter. And Jack tries to be rude to throw Oliver off his game, like by poking him about his leg and saying that, oh, he needs rest. And Oliver, though, is easygoing and able to joke and just says, well, if only rest worked. And while Oliver obviously finds Jack's practices unsavory, he can't help but discuss the conflicting details of Mrs. Wraxall's case. And Jack finds himself enjoying the volley of discussing a case because he doesn't often have someone with which to discuss his work because his sister doesn't fully approve of what he does. And so this conversation goes on until Jack finally finds a way to rid himself of Oliver. And it turns out that he only had to tell the truth. So, quote, "Are you saying you'd blackmail Mr. Wraxall? If he's the sort of man to mistreat his wife for having an affair before marriage when his own behavior hasn't been perfect, then most definitely." So Oliver can't stomach that, and he's out.
Oliver leaves, and he has decided that he's just going to go talk to his sister about what she paid Turner for. And she admits to him that Turner is the reason that her husband has been overseas for 2 years. And it kind of dawns on Oliver that his brother-in-law was kind of a not-so-savory person himself and mistreated his sister. And so now he's conflicted because he wasn't there to protect his sister, so he's happy someone like Jack Turner was there to protect his sister. But he really has problems with the idea of someone taking justice into their own hands.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And since Oliver is looking for things to do now that he's back from war, and this is why he even found out about the 200 pounds, because his sister was like, oh, look at my accounts. And he found the note about the 200 pounds and went searching for it, thinking she was taken advantage of. But now he's got the Wraxall's case on his mind, and he discovers that Mr. Wraxall is also a member at White's. And actually, when he's at White's that evening, he finds Mr. Wraxall is present. And so he strikes up a conversation and learns more about the conflicting and slightly odd facts about this couple.
So this is the case for the entire book, and we're going to actually gloss over many of the facts of the case as it's a bit convoluted and mostly makes for a good reason for our two main characters to travel together, but we promise to reveal all at the end.
Yes. Jack has also begun his investigation into the Wraxalls, and after a talk with his sister Sarah, we get some additional inner dialogue about how he knew Rivington, but Rivington didn't know him. So it turns out that Jack was previously Lord Montbray's valet, which is also how he knows Rivington's sister.
Yes, because Lord Montbray is Rivington's brother-in-law.
Yes. So Jack continues his investigation. He goes to talk to his flamboyant and conman brother, Georgie. He also visits Mrs. Wraxall's maid, who he has known previously from his childhood. And he determines that the maid, while opportunistic, has not actually blackmailed her employer. And so now he is back to square one without an idea of who the culprit may be. He returns to his office at the end of the day to find Rivington there.
And Rivington's come to reimburse any expenses incurred for getting rid of Montbray, because after he spoke with his sister, he realized that 200 pounds, quote, was hardly adequate. And Jack insists he covered Montbray's debts just fine. And Rivington keeps poking, and Jack finally admits that he pilfered some household items like cufflinks to cover the costs that Montbray had incurred from gambling and whoring and those sorts of things. And that's part of Jack's method. And Rivington is not okay with this. He really can't reconcile with it. And he feels like Turner must have broken into the house to steal them too, because at this point in time, he doesn't know that Turner was Lord Montbray's valet. So the two continue to argue and be at odds. And of course, tempers rise and flirting ensues as Rivington continues to insist on paying Turner. So, quote, "It only means that you're doing business with me as well." Rivington's cheeks went a satisfying shade of pink, and this time Jack suspected the flush was not from anger. "The question is, though, what kind of business do you want to do with me?" He had let his voice drop to a murmur. There are so many possibilities. Jack let his voice even lower, Rivington's eyes going dark by precisely the same measure, as if one man's voice and the other's eyes were connected.
Quote, But in this moment, seized by the rash urge to make that happen, Jack reached up and traced Rivington's perfect mouth with his coarse thumb. For a moment, Jack thought he was going to get punched or arrested, or who knew what. But then Rivington darted out his tongue and licked Jack's thumb.
Oh, my.
So this temper and flirting has taken new heights and freaks both men out.
Yeah, and Rivington just silently takes his leave.
So later, Oliver is mulling over his purpose in life. He's quite listless after returning injured from the war. His leg hurts no matter what, and he simply has no purpose. He's a bit jealous of Turner for his job because even though he doesn't agree with his methods, he has something to do and seems to have a purpose in life. So he also, quote, thought of those last few moments in Turner's study. He had a purpose there, too, but Oliver couldn't tell whether the man had been bent on seduction or rather luring Oliver to commit an act that would be fodder for blackmail all its own. He sighed, his desire evaporating like the dream it likely was. Probably Turner had only touched him as part of some blackmail scheme, and then had been too repulsed to go through with the act. After all, London probably had far more blackmailers than it did men who wanted to look at him like they could see straight through his clothing, right to his most secret longings.
Oh, so heart-wrenching.
It is.
So as investigations continue, we find out more about Jack's past. His family does know about his proclivities, and they seem supportive, but they want to keep him safe. His father, it seems, whored out his son, or possibly his sons. It was a little bit unclear with the details. And so now he doesn't like to tangle with gentlemen because he's afraid of getting paid for romantic interludes, and he doesn't want to repeat that. He's not ashamed of his past, but he just doesn't want to repeat it.
On the other side of the coin, Oliver's on his way home from dinner at the Wraxalls. He's continued his friendship with the mister, and Oliver makes a very stupid decision and turns down a dark alley that, quote, practically had a sign over it announcing that thieves were waiting within and would only be too happy to knock any stray gentleman over the head and relieve them of their valuables.
Seriously, I just have to interject here. I really loved that little passage that Kat put in there. Like, Oliver, you've made a really stupid decision. Like, as a reader, you're reading this and you're like, Oliver has made the stupidest decision. And then the author is like,
he went down an alleyway at night. You don't do that.
Yeah,
that's perfect book fodder.
That quote practically had a sign over it announcing that thieves. I mean, I liked that the author really had, she got that there and she was winking at us. So,
yes.
But Oliver's pretty lucky because Jack's been following him.
Well, actually, he was looking at the Wraxalls' house, and then he saw Oliver leave and was like, well, I'll just follow this dude, because what the heck is he doing?
Mm-hmm.
And comes to Oliver's rescue because Oliver has received a large bump on the head and is now facing, 3 or 4?
A bunch of guys.
A bunch of dudes. More than one.
And it's a very exciting fight.
Theatrical to the extreme.
Oh, yes. And there's swirling and throwing of the staff, and then the other one catches it, uses it on a bad guy, and then throws it back, and it's like they've been fighting side by side for years, and it was fabulous.
Yes.
And after the thrill of battle, they have a heated conversation where Jack admits to following Oliver for the Wraxhall case, and also makes some astute observations about Oliver's behavior. So he says, "Some helpful advice for you," Jack said, instinctively raising his hands to adjust the man's lapels into some semblance of order. It was a bald excuse to keep touching him, as well as the tiresome old habit of making gentlemen look presentable. "You're acting like you're looking for a wife or a mistress. Nobody goes out nearly as much as you unless he has some kind of agenda." He smoothed Rivington's collar, letting his knuckles brush across his jaw and the tender flesh beneath. "You'll wind up married, like it or not, and you're not looking for a wife any more than I am." So Jack hopes that was pretty clear. I mean, it was pretty clear to me.
So the investigation continues next on Sunday while the servants and the master and mistress are at church. So the house is empty, and Jack goes to search the house to see if there's any way Mrs. Wraxall hid the letters, Mr. Wraxall has the letters, any of the servants have the letters. Anyway, he's searching the house. And as he hears everyone come home, he retreats to the attic with a book to wait for nightfall where he can continue his search.
Which I would like to say I also thought was really smart and and interesting, and I liked that very much.
Yes. I thought that was like, he didn't just leave and come back. He
made a plan.
Like, oh, we'll go hide. Yeah, I like it.
It was smart.
He's a pretty smart dude.
Yeah.
And he does emerge later in the night, and he's followed by a very friendly dog, which he notices, and he does make a comment, which I just love, about there's no way the master could be up to anything nefarious, because nefarious people did not have dogs that were that friendly.
I also loved that. It was so cute.
Yes. However, as he's searching the library, he hears someone coming towards it, and instead of risking being caught, he jumps out the window, which wasn't one of his better moves.
No. Meanwhile, though, very conveniently, if I may say, Lord Montbray himself has returned. He's been gone for 2 years, thanks to Jack, but today he has returned, and Rivington's sister has fled with her son to a friend's house in the country, but her companion, Miss Sutherland, begs Rivington to speak with Turner before she also leaves to accompany her. So Rivington goes straight to Turner's apartments to wait, and this is while Turner is at the Wraxalls doing his reconnaissance. But Turner returns at 2 a.m., limping due to his ankle injury from the window accident, and Rivington is still there waiting outside, which seems a bit much, but hey.
Yeah, he must have been. I mean, he does say that he left to get something to eat and then came back.
Okay. Regardless, he's still there, and Jack's in pain, and he's a bit of a grouch, and he says a comment about Rivington's tendencies, which gets Rivington all roughed up, and he just flat out asks Jack if he's going to blackmail him. And Jack replies, "God, are you that dim? Probably. When it came to some things, definitely. Then let me clear things up, because I am not going to blackmail you, you bloody interfering toff, for a lot of reasons, not least of which is that it's a nasty fucking thing to do, but also, you daft bastard, if I blackmailed you for happening to prefer men, you could blackmail me right back. Did you somehow not notice that I nearly fucked you against a building on Piccadilly the other night?"
Ew. Just that line gave me tinglies.
I know, it was so good. So they have their first kiss, quote, just so they're perfectly clear. And then they go up to Jack's apartment, where Jack's poor scraped fingers from his fall render him unable to undo his buttons, and Oliver has to help him undress.
And Oliver starts to ogle, but then gets shy when Jack says that he must change to untorn breeches as well. And it wasn't that Oliver's inexperienced, it's just that all of his experience has been transactional by nature, and this is flirting and a tender kiss, and he's way out of his depth, because this is actually like two people meeting and having a connection, and he's never experienced that before.
And it's so sweet. Oh,
it is.
My heart is melting for him.
And Jack is also starving after his whole waiting in the attic and then coming out of a window. And he's also comforted by the idea of feeding a much too thin Rivington, who admits that he's really lost his appetite since his leg has been injured, and so he really just doesn't eat much. So they go out to eat at the only place serving this late at night, which is a whorehouse.
But the food is delicious, and they have a lovely conversation where Jack admits that he was Montbray's valet and that he saw Oliver in the orangery. So yay, we're out in the open.
Oh, we are in the open. Now we got to figure out how this works out between them.
And the conversation is so nice, in fact, that Oliver is a bit tipsy from the whole experience. And, quote, "Oh, don't start with that." Turner jerked back in his chair so abruptly that Oliver could hear the wood creak. "Don't look at me like you're going to start leaving posies by my door." It was the tone one would use to scold a cat who had dropped a dead animal at one's feet. "Did you miss the part where I admitted to being habitually dishonest and told you that I used to be a servant at your sister's house? And when I wasn't a servant, I was a thief. Sometimes I was both at the same time. Sometimes I was a good deal worse than any of those things." Oliver kept his gaze on the table. "Posies don't enter into it," he whispered, and then he felt his cheeks get hot.
Their meal, however, is interrupted when Georgie, Turner, turns up, and he is delightful and teasing and playful, but also has informations about Wraxall. None of it's particularly interesting or helpful, though, and Georgie leaves the scene. So Jack and Oliver also have discussed his sister's predicament over the course of the evening, and Jack agrees that she should stay out of town while he finds the right people to get rid of Montbray again. Because obviously the last one didn't do his job properly.
Yes, and we're not talking murder. That is not Jack's deal at all. He fixes problems, but there's lines that even he doesn't cross.
And it also becomes apparent that Jack needs to travel to Mrs. Wraxall's hometown because it is still the residence of her former lover. Her mom still lives there, and so he unfortunately needs to leave London. And Oliver thinks this is a lovely excuse because he was planning to buy a curricle for himself. And what better reason than he can take Jack on this adventure, because as a gentleman, he can open a lot more doors. And Jack and him kind of squabble about it, about traveling together. But eventually, they set off on the adventure together.
They do. They're going to, quote, see a man about a horse, since that is the most stereotypical cover story. Usually the simplest is the best. So on the way, we learn that Jack does not particularly enjoy carriage travel. He is a bit worried about it, and he gets carriage sick, and Oliver finds this so endearing. So he drives carefully, and he chats constantly to help keep Jack's mind off of things. And along the way, of course, they learn more about each other, and Oliver starts to call Jack Jack, while Jack stubbornly refuses to refer to Oliver by anything other than Rivington. But Jack, starting to feel uncomfortable with this familiarity and comfort that Oliver is giving him, decides to make things difficult for Rivington because he's scrambling and he doesn't know what else to do.
So he lets the carriage jerk him into Rivington, brushes against him every chance he gets, adjusts his cravat, leers at his breeches, all sorts of double entendres. It's all to get Rivington to blush, which he just finds so enchanting. But of course, this all turns around on him when he asks Rivington to let him steer the horses. And so Rivington does the whole behind the back here, let me put my hands on your hands. And Jack is like, well, this was meant to hot and bother you, but now I'm hot and bothered. So nope, we're done.
It's so funny and so good.
Yes. That evening, Oliver's also stuck in his boots. And this is a very real thing that happens.
Yes. Raise your hand if you have been stuck in your tall boots. Me.
That's why mine has zippers.
Oh, mine. See, I have zippered ones, but I used to not have zippered ones. Kelsey and I are both horse people. And let me tell you that real stiff dressage boots and also real narrow ones are difficult to get off. And there are things called boot jacks or valets back in the day. So
exactly. So he's physically and sexually frustrated. So he's cursing up a storm, and he's mad that he can't even function without a valet for a couple of days. And the servants at the hotel aren't answering his bell either. So he's just super mad because he doesn't want to bother Jack about his boot. However, Jack hears him and helps him get his boot off. And they're in the room alone together, which leads to a kiss and some hands over bodies, which prompts Oliver to say, oh God, you ought to get on with it unless you want me to have an apoplexy. Just so you know. Jack replies, no, I don't think I will get on with it. I'm going to take my time with you, Rivington. And Jack truly means it. There's just a kiss that night. And while at first Oliver is disappointed, he quickly accedes, quote, time. That was what Oliver wanted too, even more than he wanted immediate relief from the desire that was consuming all his senses. He wanted something that wasn't hurried and soon forgotten. Fine, he whispered. Take your time then.
Oh, so the journey continues, and they arrive at the village the next day, and they begin the next stage of their investigation of the townsfolk under the guise of, quote, I was supposed to call on a friend of my sister's, but I've forgotten the friend's name. Perhaps you know Lady Montbray? They question some people, and here is the sum of the facts from their village visit, because it's better this way. So her old governess is living in a home well above her means, and the home is owned by Mrs. Wraxall's mother. Mrs. Wraxall's former paramour, Mr. Lewis, and his wife are both Major Dicks. Mm-hmm. There is continued ambiguity around how or why Mrs. Wraxall didn't marry Mr. Lewis and how she did end up marrying Mr. Wraxall. None of these folks so far are the blackmailer. Also, Oliver and Jack grow closer, and Oliver realizes that Jack is someone he could hold dear. Jack sees the growing closeness and throws a wrench into it by being an asshole and says some very mean observations about Oliver to his face.
Oliver realizes later that night, as he downs a bottle of brandy, that Jack had said those things to push him away. He's worried about Oliver getting too close, and luckily he has had these realizations when Jack enters his room. So Jack has come to say he was an idiot, because he realizes he's pushing Oliver away and he's being dumb about it. So he helps Oliver out of his boots and apologizes by way of stating the positive observations he's made about Oliver. And the intimacy increases. Oliver says, quote, "Not as an apology." Jack replies, "Not as an apology, because I've been thinking about this for days, years even, if I'm being honest." And they get into encounter number 1.
Woo.
Oliver gets a fantastic blowjob, but does not get to repay the favor because Jack gets scared with all the feels and lashes out with harsh words to get Oliver to stop. Quote, "Perhaps I don't feel like tutoring a nobleman's son in the finer points of cocksucking. And what makes you think I need tutoring?"
Yeah, so that weakens Jack's resolve, and Oliver does get to reciprocate with a hand job. And apparently it's really fantastic because at the end of the experience, Jack knows that he's in trouble and he doesn't know what to do about it. And the next day dawns and they begin talking about the case again. And Jack shows Oliver the cards that he uses to organize his thoughts upon. This is important for 2 reasons, but later, and I didn't note them later, so I'm going to say them now. We find out that his mother was a charlatan, fortune teller, tarot card reader, so that's kind of who he gets that card organization from. And also later, Oliver ends up giving him a monogrammed card case that he can keep those cards safe inside. So they're just kind of nice little details, but not particularly important. And so they head back to the road.
In the curricle, the aforementioned cards go flying out of Jack's lap, and they have to stop to pick them up. They have a roadside moment where they discuss feelings from the night before and have a very sweet hug. And Jack once again confesses that he was an idiot. And Oliver replies, "Is that what you're going to say every time you try to push me away?" This also scares Jack because of the feelings and everything. But when Rivington leans in, Jack doesn't push away this time. Quote, "Everything's so easy with you," Jack said, pulling back from the kiss. "It's as if you don't know what a bad idea this all is."
So that evening, they are together in Jack's room and things get steamy very quickly. So they have encounter number 2, which involves a whole lot of fun positions, and they're both very strong. It's very spicy. So in the morning, they awake together, and Jack is not sure whether he's happy or irritated about it because a servant might notice, but it was also lovely to have Oliver next to him. And they have cute morning explorations that lead to encounter number 3. So these boys are having a good time.
Yes. After breakfast, Oliver has a pretty dumb idea that they stop at his father's house on the way back to London. So his father, the Earl, has basically been retired to the country. He doesn't come to London anymore. And since they're close by, Oliver's like, well, I kind of want to go there because he grew up there and he has fond memories of it. So they go.
Again, Oliver's father is old, the kind of old lord that is wasting away behind the thick curtains of his apartment. And during this trip, we learn that his dad kind of sucks. His dad knew that Turner helped Lord Montbray disappear, and he asks him to help again, but more permanently. Turner says he is not the man for that kind of job. And then Rivington's father offers Turner £200 to stay away from his son, which Oliver overhears.
And Oliver is very upset by this information and has a huff. But then the 2 gentlemen have an honest conversation.
Yes.
And a delightful private dinner, followed by a fantastic fuck under his father's roof. So there's encounter number 4 in the library with tongues and fingers, in which Jack states, That was some professional quality cocksucking.
So good. So they're just buttoning up when they hear a commotion out on the drive. And it is one of the men that was supposed to be watching Lord Montbray. And he has come to say that Lord Montbray has conveniently died. And Jack needs to leave quickly to get to London about this. And Oliver scrambles and makes some seriously disjointed accusations, which at least Jack doesn't take to heart. And the two of them part and make their own ways back to London. Basically, Oliver feels that, did Jack do this? Did Jack kill him? And Jack's like, of course I didn't kill him. Come on. Like, you think about it for 2 seconds. That's not me. And so Oliver returns to London to find his sister sitting in her apartments in black crepe, eating cake and reading a novel. And she can barely contain her glee that Lord Montbray is dead. So she is going to hole up in the country during her mourning period so as not to seem garish to others, because she doesn't think that she can seem appropriately sad or mournful about this.
Nope.
And her companion is also there, but she doesn't look quite as luminous. She looks quite upset and weary in contrast.
However, this is all well and good, but now we can't forget that the Wraxall mystery has yet to be solved.
So true.
So Oliver runs into Mr. Wraxall on the street, and Mr. Wraxall gives Oliver a piece of information, which is Mrs. Wraxall's mother is in town and they're leaving for Kent tomorrow. So Rivington heads to Jack's to give him that information. And while they're there, they discuss the fact that both agree that Montbray didn't die by accident. I mean, drunk people do fall down the stairs and kill themselves sometimes, but Montbray's never been one to be that clumsy while drunk. He's mean, but that's different. So far, it's been ruled an accident, but Oliver wants to look into it, and Jack's like, who cares? It's done. Let them be them. Like, they did someone a favor by killing him. And Oliver just hates that because justice is justice and you can't be a vigilante. And then Jack brings up their buggery. Quote, the only thing that puzzles me is that you have such a high regard for the rule of law when you yourself break the law with pleasure. He dropped his voice so there could be no mistaking what law he was referring to. And abandon, he added, for sheer sake of being offensive, and maybe also because it was the truth.
Oof. So the two leave at odds, and later that week, Oliver is feeling down and realizes he was a bit hard on Jack earlier, and he ends up having an honest conversation with his sister, who isn't an idiot or a bigot and has no issues offering her vague support to whatever relationship he should choose to pursue. So he heads to Jack's office to apologize, and Jack is quite surprised by a gentleman apologizing. He says it's all fine, but Oliver continues to explain. Quote, it's only that I prefer to think that there's some order governing the world, some absolute rights and wrongs, and I like to think that order overlaps with the law, at least to some extent. And so now they have an apology, a conversation, and a better understanding of each other, and we're primed and ready for encounter number 5.
Mm-hmm.
And in this steamy one, we have oral and penetration. We've got some fun positions. We use the word love to refer to each other. And this time at the end, there is a promise of tomorrow.
Ah, so this relationship is becoming more of a thing. So our main characters begin their courtship in earnest, and they go places together, namely a lot of places where Jack can tempt the too skinny Rivington with delicious food. And during this time, Oliver mentions buying a small country house with no servants, and would Jack consider staying there? But Jack's really adamant that that wouldn't work. He needs to work. Plus, how would Oliver explain his life all of a sudden that he needs to take holidays with a commoner? And it was easier to hide their friendship in London, in his opinion.
But their courtship continues, and we sort of have an encounter in the middle that is not descriptive except for, like, the after morning. And I'm calling that encounter number 5.5.
All right, there you go. And as the two continue to grow closer, we learn that Jack's mother was murdered for her fakery, and no one ever brought justice to her death. And it's also been a while, but we can't forget there's a couple mysteries afoot. We still don't know who killed Montbray, and someone's still potentially blackmailing Mrs. Wraxall. So we're going to go back to that thread because Oliver has been invited to the Wraxall's house party that they're throwing in Kent. And after much hemming and hawing, they decide to go with Jack posing as his valet. Oliver brought 24 shirts for the week, though, so Jack doesn't actually have to do any valet duties. He's just there posing as one.
So
literally.
cute. Yes. And at the party, we learn that Mrs. Wraxall's mother, Mrs. Durbin, is a wily old lady who even threatens Rivington directly when she suspects him digging around. But Rivington gets lucky, and when a wasted Mr. Wraxall is prompted, he admits that he found and stole the letters. However, in a twist, someone has stole the letters from him.
Oh, man. But they were only stolen the night before they left London.
Ooh.
Oh. So later that evening, the pair are discussing their findings, and Jack admits that he's figured out the whole thing. And he says, "Follow me. I shall show you." And the pair are sneaking out, being cat burglar types in the hallways, when all of a sudden, Jack hears a very familiar clicking and jumps in front of Oliver as a shot cracks through the hallway.
Oof.
And they scramble back to Oliver's room where they play doctor because Oliver realizes Jack's been shot in the arm, and somehow they manage to get shot and make it back to their room without anyone figuring out the two of them were involved.
Yeah,
I don't actually understand how that happens.
Yeah.
But Jack knows who shot them. But we'll get to that in a second, because during the doctoring, we have our declaration of love.
Oh.
Which is a little too long to read right now, but great. It's on page 194, so if you want to read it, go right ahead.
It's so sweet. And after that, Jack is aroused and a little high from the laudanum that Oliver gave him, so Oliver takes charge. And we have encounter number 6, which is a reversal of positions and a show of trust and love. But afterwards, it's bittersweet because Oliver says, quote, "I wish we could stay like this," Oliver said, knowing it was pathetic, plaintive. Jack was silent for a moment. So do I. Neither of them had to say they couldn't.
In the morning, though, we need to confront the shooter, who turns out to be Mrs. Durbin, who found the letters in her son-in-law's office and realized that her daughter was going to use them to blackmail Mr. Lewis, because no one was actually blackmailing Mrs. Wraxall. She made that part up.
Mm-hmm.
But she basically offered Mr. Lewis's wife information that said if he mistreats her, she has a way to blackmail him, so she can always come to Mrs. Wraxall for help if she needs it.
So that morning, Oliver ends up getting a letter, too, from his father, and that his father is in London, and he leaves the house party immediately to attend to it, and he leaves £20 for Jack to find his way home. And Oliver's father is now trying to bribe or blackmail him into staying away from Jack. So his father knows what's going on.
Yeah.
But Oliver has had enough and he will not give in. And his father somehow knows that Jack was a whore and he dropped that bomb. But again, Oliver doesn't really care. He realizes that he needs to have a life with Jack and he has to figure out how to do that.
Also, he feels really bad about leaving Jack £20 now.
Yes, he does. And before Oliver can figure out how to make that work, he and Jack end up meeting in his sister's parlor because they are about to hear the confession from the murderer of his brother-in-law, Lord Montbray. And it turns out it was his sister's companion, who was also Lord Montbray's cousin. She tripped him down the stairs after he did some horrible things, and she is sad. And Oliver ends up coming to her aid by telling a terrible war story, which shows that he understands and accepts her actions.
Jack obviously approves of Oliver's story and the fact that he was the one to comfort Miss Sutherland, and they talk before parting ways. Oliver apologizes for running off and leaving money on the nightstand, but Jack understands why he did it. So they're good, but there really isn't a feeling that there's a future, and Jack can't see one that works out well, and they should just split ways before anything bad happens. But Oliver's determined to find a way for them to be together. And now this is really where the class struggle comes in, because Oliver is a gentleman, and Jack just can't see any way a gentleman and a working class person can be together without raising eyebrows.
So Oliver can, and he sets about orchestrating his ruin. He runs up gambling debts, and he learns how to cheat at cards from Jack's brother, Georgie. Also, side note, while this is happening, Jack convinces his sister Sarah to be a fortune teller for a night and to make the ton think that Mrs. Wraxall is lucky so that she can have the life she wanted. And I mention this because I think it might be important if Sarah ever has a book, but
also it also shows Jack's caring nature for Mrs. Wraxall, and he's not just a scoundrel out to get people's money. He does truly care, and being with Oliver kind of brings out his caring nature.
So, news of Oliver's whoring and gambling reaches Jack, who finds him before he purposefully cheats so badly to get caught. That was his plan. He was going to cheat and get caught. And he stops it from happening. And Jack understands why Oliver was doing it. And he has also decided to give in to what he truly wants. And he says, "You're never going to be anything than good and honorable. And mine."
It's fantastic because that's so beautiful. And they find a place in London to rent, which has like the living area on the first floor. So Oliver doesn't have to worry about going up and down the stairs with his bad leg. And it's just really cute. And the guise is that sharing a house is a reasonable economy that might be made by a gentleman who has had a run of bad luck at cards.
So they settle into life where Jack finds that he enjoys buying Oliver nice things for their home. Quote, "Nobody had been more surprised than Jack to discover that when he was happy, he wanted to make others happy. What a soggy lot of rubbish, but there you had it." Aw, so they live happily ever after together. And we have lots to talk about and other people to talk about it with.
Yes.
So before we get started with all that, shall we adjourn to the parlor?
We shall.
So we are going to keep it short and sweet here in the parlor today as we have a very packed episode for you guys.
Yes. So short and sweet, in fact, that we don't even have a book recommendation at this time. But we would love to hear from you. And to be fair, we do have a book recommendation. They're just incorporated into the end of our episode. So if you have anything you would like to recommend, you can send us an email at romancepod@gmail.com.
Absolutely. And if you want to find us on social media, we're pretty much everywhere. Instagram and Twitter, we're at TN Strumpets, T as in Tom, N as in Nancy. And Facebook and Pinterest at /TN Strumpets, the same spelling as before. And also you can find our episodes on YouTube.
And if you really want to be in the know, you can sign up for our email notifications on our website. Our website is romancepod.com. And there you can find episodes, more information about us, blogs. So take a look.
And finally, I also just want to say that this is our first time talking about a gay romance. And if there's anything that you hear here today that you think was amiss for any reason in phrasing or thought, please let us know. We're trying our best, but we are inexperienced and we always want to do better. Today, we are joined by some very special guests. Their podcast, the Big Gay Fiction Podcast, was listed in Oprah magazine in 21 of the best book podcasts to listen to when you're not reading. It's Jeff Adams and Will Knauss.
Hello. Thanks
Hi,
for having
guys.
us here.
Hi there, guys.
Hello, hello. We're so happy you could be here with us today.
So, Jeff and Will you guys tell us a little bit about you and your podcast?
Well, I guess I'll start. I'm Jeff. I'm an author of gay romance and young adult fiction. We started our podcast in 2015 because we were reading so much great gay fiction. We wanted to talk about that with the world and share, the books that we love. And then we got into interviewing authors too. And then it was a matter of having all these wonderful authors on to come on and talk about their books.
Oh, that's awesome. I have listened to a few episodes of you guys, and I'm a new fan. So, in fact, I believe you guys are quite familiar with Cat Sebastian's work, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. We read The Soldier's Scoundrel right after it came out back in 2017. We had Cat on the show in episode 92 when the third book of this series came out, which was Ruin of the Rake. Kat has put out another tremendous series this past year. And I actually put The Gentleman Never Keeps Score onto my best books of 2019, because that book just was so outstanding. She is an ace at writing Regency romance in the gay romance space.
I listened to your interview with Kat before this because I had to hear it. And it was really interesting and fascinating. And she answered a lot of the questions that I had. And kind of just about how you can write a happily ever after in a time when what they were doing was against the law. And so I thought it was really interesting, some of her answers to those questions about like knowing how that living in secret may not be some people's version of a happily ever after, but that's how they could live happily ever after in that time. And so while it may disqualify that for some readers, that's what she wants to write. And she does a brilliant job doing it.
She really does. And it's one of the things, going back and reading this book, because since it's been a couple years, I wanted to reread it before we talk to you about it, is that it's an ongoing discussion between Jack and Oliver, even as they have this attraction that they're fighting against it because it's not easy living in the Regency with this type of romance. So
true. And so Kelsey and I, obviously, we have a Regency romance podcast, right? We love Regency romance. And this was, for both of us, the first time that we'd ever read a queer romance. So this is our very first book. And I guess I'll go first and just say that I loved it. Like, I loved it so much. I'm going to get into deeper about the book in general, but like, this was fantastic. Like, I feel kind of not bad, but I kind of wonder like why I didn't think at all about reading gay romance before now. It really wasn't a conscious decision of like, oh, I don't want to read that. It was more like, well, there's tons of dukes that I can read about, so I'll just keep reading about dukes. But yeah, I was so in love with these boys and their love, and like they just they got my heart.
Yes. And I think you kind of hit it on the head with the idea of, I know Kat said that some people can't imagine the idea of living in secret as a happily ever after, but I was not disappointed with the happily ever after. I really liked the happily ever after. And you had mentioned how Jack and Oliver have this conversation through the whole book about what their life together is going to look like and how they shouldn't pursue it, but they should pursue it. And I loved that. The biggest thing I have throughout this whole podcast, and we discuss Regency romances, for me, I'm the biggest fan of honest conversation between the main characters. And this whole book was an honest conversation and a growing relationship with honest dialogue. And I loved it for that.
One of the things that irritates me in romance overall is anytime you could solve a problem, if you'd only had a moment to have that conversation, that kind of fake drama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Unnecessary drama.
I know. I'll often in our notes, I'll write like in all caps, like a very honest conversation or whatever it is, because it just feels like finally they've done the thing. And it is great. Secrets are a great device. And, they when used properly, they do good things. But I think especially when you're talking about a life that maybe has to have some secrets around it, having secrets between the two characters, I think would be even more difficult. And I actually really loved the way that she had the two characters come out to each other, because obviously we start out with Jack knowing that Oliver is gay because he witnessed Oliver having a moment with another man. So there is kind of this imbalance there. And I was really interested to see how she was going to unweave that and how Oliver was going to feel comfortable and believe that Jack was also gay. And she did such a great job of showing the dangers of the time, that like Oliver thought maybe Jack was trying to blackmail him, right? But she didn't ever go too far with that plot line, in my opinion. And they came to open honesty pretty quickly enough that they got to then have a love story. And I thought that was really, really cool. So, Kelsey, what were your thoughts about this book in general?
Oh, I think I stated it pretty clearly as far as like my enjoyment of the relationship and the growing bond between them and the intimacy that grew between them. I thought it all felt very organic. None of it felt forced. I thought it all derived from good motivations on both characters' points. It wasn't like we suddenly jumped because it made sense just for the plot line. It was all very organic, and I really enjoyed it. I loved Kat's writing in this. I thought she has these beautiful phrases and these beautiful prose. I know we talked about them a bit in the synopsis, where we both kind of were like, about it. But I really, this being my first experience with gay romance, like I really loved it. And I just loved it because you really felt a true, honest relationship growing. And I mean, that's the whole point of romance, right? Is we want to read about the relationship growing and having that bond between people forming to make the happily ever after. I think you and I mentioned it quickly. As far as like plot lines go, like sometimes I felt our mystery wasn't quite at the forefront where it should be. I thought it was a good device to get the plot along, but sometimes I felt like we forgot about it for a little bit and suddenly it was like, oh wait, the mystery is still afoot.
Yeah. And I don't know how you guys felt about that, because you've read other Cat Sebastian books, and I know that you guys really, especially A Gentleman Never Keeps Score, talked about how fantastic that one is. But this was her first book, I believe. So how did you guys feel plot-wise that this one was for you?
I think, number one, when this book first came out, it was sort of getting a lot of attention because the paperback was getting into bookstores, and that's actually a rare occurrence for a gay romance. And so it was getting a lot of press when it first came out. And I freely admit that I was not a reader of historical romance at all. I read the North and South books by John Jakes when I was in high school, and that had really been my sole experience with historical. And while those books are like, you know, they have a whole lot of like sex and violence and drama, they're also like really like incredibly steeped in history, like pages and pages and chapters of like history book stuff. So I had assumed for many, many years that historicals just weren't for me. I wasn't interested in them. So when this Cat Sebastian book came along, I was like, yeah, okay, I guess I'll give that a try. And from the moment I like cracked it open, I was like, okay, I get it. This is really great stuff. And I'm really, really into it. Because just like contemporary romance, it's really about the people. So that's what I enjoyed the most about this book. Just as an aside, I think it's safe to say that Jeff and I both loved it to pieces. If I would have like one teeny tiny microscopic criticism is that the plot device of the mysteries, the cases that our two heroes are essentially trying to solve, the fact that there are two of them means that there are a lot of different characters and a lot of different relationships in play. And I don't know about you, but I get confused if there are like too many characters with lots of names and lords and ladies, and I don't understand the relationships and the connections. So when I reread this book just recently, I read it very, very quickly. And I think that's probably the best way to read this book. That way, all of those characters are still fresh in your mind. If you read this book and like set it down for a day or two, you might forget some of those like tangential, subplotty kind of things.
Yeah.
So that's my only incredibly minor criticism. The book itself, I really loved. And if your listeners haven't gotten onto the audiobook bandwagon, I highly recommend trying the audiobook for The Soldier's Scoundrel. It's read by a guy named Gary Furlong, and he does an amazing job.
Oh my.
Absolutely beautiful, absolutely wonderful, especially when it comes to these two characters, the way he differentiates the vibe between Jack and Oliver. And one thing that struck me as I was reading it this second time around was there's this sort of like really charming and funny snarkiness that these two characters have, particularly Jack. He takes a lot of this stuff very seriously, and he kind of snips and snipes at Oliver, mainly because of the class difference. I think it bothers Jack more than he's like willing to admit. He wants to be like the laid back cool guy. And it's like, I'm cool. I don't care that you're all fancy and high tone, but he really does. It's like it's a big point of contention between the two of them.
Yes.
So I really enjoyed the audiobook, and I really enjoyed like you said, the honesty of the way these two characters talk and interact with one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just to pick up a little bit on the mystery sort of plot, I love romantic suspense. It is one of my major jams in contemporary. And yet here, I didn't mind the unbalance, because for me, this was more a story about Jack and Oliver. And yes, it was the mystery that kind of tied them together, as essentially Oliver started tracking along as the sidekick. But to me, I didn't come into this thinking I was going to read a mystery or a romantic suspense, and it could have been pick anything that brought the two together. And them being together was the driving part of the story. So that unbalance didn't really bother me.
Okay.
I agree, but maybe I'm a little bit harsher than everybody on the plot. When I think about this book, though, I don't really think about the subplot of the mystery. And I think the mystery is the weakest link, of course, because Jack and Oliver are just so phenomenal. And they're, like you said, they're dynamic, their conversations and everything about them is just so fantastic that the kind of weak plot that is a little bit convoluted pales in comparison. But the thing is, because they're so fantastic, I don't really mind it. Like, I kind of give it a pass because the adventure and the mystery was just all so that they could be set in different scenes together. And because of that, I'm fine with it. And also knowing that this is an author's first book, I'm like, oh, well, she's probably going to make some different editorial choices as she goes along and say, you know what, I don't really need this, or I can simplify this because I can rely on how strong my characters are, and I can just do this and that and the other thing. And so to me, that's just like, that's a first book. Are you kidding me? Like, I mean, like I am really excited to continue reading her books and read the rest. I want to know more. I want to know about Georgie. I want to know about who I really couldn't get a read on this book, but I know he has a book, and I honestly couldn't tell if he was straight or he was gay or he was bi or he was a con man. I mean, I knew he was a con man, but I was also wondering if he was actually transgender and like a woman as a man. And I was fascinated and I wanted to know.
The next book in this particular series focuses on Georgie. And it's really remarkable. You're right. You don't quite get a feel for who he is. He's just sort of Jack's brother, the con man, is how he's kind of labeled in this book. But the avenues that Sebastian goes down in the second book are really interesting and fascinating and kind of unexpected.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I think you'll be really into it. I think you'll like
it. I mean, it's really interesting through her, I want to say 6 gay romance historicals, that she really pivots the issues and stories that she tackles each time. And that that makes them all the sweeter, because you're just not getting kind of the same formula over and over again, which sometimes is exactly what you do need. But here it's just a different exploration of these issues and the way that these people could have lived in the time.
So I know we could talk about the whole book all day, but let's get into some of the finer points and give our main characters ratings. So on our show, we rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, and it's subjective, right? Because it's really how you feel about them. I feel like there's a couple of points that go towards like just how much you love them, and then also just generally how they rate on a scale of 1 to 10, as whatever 10 means to you, as in fully developed or the best character you've ever seen on paper or surprised you or whatever the thing is. So we won't make you guys go first on this. But Kelsey, what would you rate? Let's start with Oliver. What would you rate Oliver?
So Oliver, for me, I'm going to think I'm going to rate both these guys really highly, because I thought they were very self-assured of who they were. Even when they were questioning things, they kind of had a good feeling of who they were as themselves, and that for me rates a bit higher. For Oliver, I think that he's going to be like a 7.5, I'm going to say. Because
All
I
right.
felt that Oliver, he had some bit of like shyness and kind of going back and forth a bit for me as far as just his big plan of vigilante justice is bad, but not super strict rule of law. Like, I like that he was able to grow with the book and change his mind about that. And I knew that it all stemmed from his past war experience. So I don't mind that, but I just felt there was a little bit a lack of strength to rate him a little higher for me. Like, I wanted him a little bit more firmly in his convictions versus like he was firm, but I never felt the conviction behind his statements. So 7.5 for me, but I overall really liked him. I thought he was really adorable. I just really did.
Jeff or Will, do you guys want to give him a rating together or separate?
I personally would, well, okay, I'll be on. I would give him a 10 out of 10.
Great.
I
Love
loved
it.
both these guys. I think what you were saying about him, like maybe the firmness of his character, or maybe the wishy-washiness, may have come from the fact that he is a soldier back from war, and now he's expected to essentially live the life of a gentleman, this life of leisure. And I think he spends a good part of the book trying to understand his place in society now. And he's not sure. He doesn't really know. He spends a good deal of it figuring that out while he's falling in love with Jack at the same time. So I don't think that's necessarily a flaw in his character. It's just that he has got some stuff that he's trying to work through. At least that's how I viewed it. The second time that I was reading through it.
No, yeah, I get that.
Yeah, for me, I'm definitely cruising in that 9 to 10 range as well. I liked that evolution that you talked about for, you know, how he went. I mean, when he first bursts into the room, like, how dare you have taken this money? Who are you?
Yeah.
To evolving through the story and getting this idea of what Jack really does and who Jack really is. But then there's that whole side of it too that Will mentioned of he's sorting all this out, and it's not just back from war, but he's also back from war and rather severely injured. You know, and having to not only get back into civilian life, but with the fact that he's not the man that he was before the war, if only because of that injury, because injuries back then of that kind even were so debilitating, even if you had money. Because it's so much harder to get around, if nothing else.
Yeah.
But just the growth trajectory too. I mean, he grew so much from being that blustery guy to where you end with him in the epilogue. It was awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I'm also like notoriously the harshest judge on this show. So you guys almost talked me up because, man, I love him too. But I'm going to stick with my original thought. I'm going to say I would give Oliver a 7. I think he's fantastic. And that to me, a 7, that's how a 7 works for me. The reason I think he's lower is because he, as a character, I'm looking at him like as a character, he just makes some dumb decisions that I don't agree with, where like turning down the dark alley, which Kat has this great thing where she talks about like it's literally an alley that should have a sign over it that says like you're going to get accosted here. But I was like, you turned down the alley. You just came from war. This is a bit incongruous as a character. You know, I feel like he would be a little bit more heightened and on alert. And also then he decides to like leave after the shooting and go immediately to his father. He also decides to take his lover to his father's house. It's just kind of a little bit weird. So to me, those decisions like put him at a 7, but I just loved his, you know, he's the war hero and he's a bit inexperienced, not with sexual encounters, but he's never been able to be in love. And that was the most endearing, heartwarming thing. And I just loved him so much for it. Like I loved seeing him get to experience those things and just fight for it. And so that was really great. So
when you brought up the idea of him turning into a dark alleyway, as I was reading through it the second time, I realized something really that I thought was funny that the author did. When Oliver makes that decision to go down that dark alley, and Jack sees him do that. Jack kind of decides, I'm going to swoop in and save him, when in reality, Oliver doesn't really need saving at all.
Oh, no, he had that firmly in hand.
Yeah, pretty much. And what I thought was really charming and amusing is that almost immediately after that, Jack gets himself in a bit of a jam and he falls out of a window. So when he goes back to his office above the dress shop, he encounters Oliver, and Jack's a little like beaten up and scraped. And Oliver is there are a lot of like hurt comfort trope things going on in both of those specific moments, because even though their injuries are not particularly severe, each of our heroes are taking, this specific opportunity to like fuss over the other hero and making sure that they're okay. And that's their way of exploring and showing their growing affection for one another. Even though, like I mentioned before, they're actually still being particularly snarky at this point in the story, but it's their chance to touch his cheek or tie his cravat and make sure he's okay, that kind of a thing. And it's really adorable and funny and sexy in its own way.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah. I agree.
Totally agreed. So I'll get us started on Jack. I think Jack's a little higher. I think Jack's an 8. I think he's such a strong hero. I think he is really interesting. I love. He's got this gruff exterior, but really, and it's just been like barriers that he's put up to kind of protect himself. And then when he finally falls in love, he does it in such a beautiful way. And I love at the end how he's with this gentleman who he didn't want to be with a gentleman, right? Because he didn't like the kind of difference in class, but he ends up with this gentleman. And then of course he wants to like buy him nice things because he's a gentleman and a gentleman should have nice things. And that brings him joy. And that's the cutest thing ever. I love the little grumpy guy who also is actually just a real softie at heart. And so I don't know. I thought the reason that I don't rate him higher is because I actually think that as a fixer, he kind of didn't do that great of a job with his blackmail thing. I mean, he got shot. So I feel like maybe we could have hurried that up. But again, he's great. I'm so excited to read more of her characters.
Yes. I'm also going to pick up on that because I also would rate Jack an 8. I really liked him. I think that at times he was a little too gruff, but the reason why he salvaged himself for me was because he would immediately acknowledge the fact that he'd been an idiot and say he'd been being an idiot. So I really like that about him, but agreed. I just really like his gruff exterior and then his big old softiness that comes to play, and how being with Oliver, I think he rates higher a little bit just because I feel like I saw more of a change through him. I know Oliver's more change was kind of an internal change, but I feel like Jack's change was a little more external. And the fact that he wanted to make Mrs. Wrexall popular at the end of the book just because it was a nice thing to do and he was happy, so she should be happy too. And I just felt that changed just a lot more. It fit with him, but also was just a bit more external, and I saw a little bit more of it. So for me, that's why he rates higher.
See, for me, Jack rates just a touch lower.
Interesting.
If only because of all that gruff exterior. It's like...
Gotcha.
A little too much.
A little too much. I felt like he was hard on Oliver a little bit too long.
Fair.
Even while he was trying to ease his inner turmoil over it, it's like, dude, cut the guy a break here,
Yeah.
Totally
and again,
fair.
it's only a touch. Like, if Oliver's the 10, Jack's like the 9.5.
Aww.
Yeah.
Because it's just that titch lower. Because I also really like how, and I think this comes a little bit on another part of, life in the Regency, where women weren't able to, necessarily take action so much. And he was able to help those who did need some help, but because of society couldn't necessarily go to the police or talk to their husband or talk to a member of their family. And so he was there to help fix that problem, even though he hated that he was helping that class of people at the same time. So that was kind of my feeling on Jack.
Okay.
I would also give Jack a 10 out of 10. Even though he is very gruff at certain points in the story, there are even certain instances where some of the things he says to Oliver are particularly cruel. But the thing is that Oliver sees him. Oliver knows what's going on. He thinks it's sort of cute and amusing. He's like, oh, Jack, I see what you're doing there. You're pushing me away. You're totally into me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, the fact is that Jack got shot protecting his man. So that's 10 out of 10 behavior for me.
All right. Fair.
Totally fair. So Kelsey and I usually share one of our favorite quotes. I don't know if you guys have a favorite quote. Oh, you do? Okay.
I ended up with one.
Okay, cool. Do you guys want to go first and share with us your favorite?
I can do that. So mine came out of chapter 6, and it's a Jack quote. And this kind of goes right to the push away you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. My point is, since you're the type of gentleman who needs this sort of thing spelled out for him, I'm more than game for a roll in the hay, a mutual scratching of backs, as early and as often as you like, but I'm not interested even slightly in an affair of the heart.
Aw.
So that is exactly what Will was just talking about with that push away.
Yeah.
Because even by chapter 6, he's totally game for the affair of the heart with this guy. But that is so typical of Jack's dialogue. And I have to say, the way that Gary delivers it in the audiobook just sells it all the more.
I'm going to have to listen. I'm not normally a big audiobook listener. I used to. I'm a huge podcast listener. But I don't listen to a lot of audiobooks. And you guys have recommended this one. And there's another, my book group has recommended a specific audiobook narrator that is a woman who does a lot of the Regencies that they just said is absolutely stunning. So I'm going to definitely have to check out some audiobooks soon.
Kat really scored on her narrators because this first series of hers is all Gary Furlong. Mm-hmm. And her new series is Joel Leslie, who also just does outstanding accents and performances. So you can't go wrong with Kat's books in audio.
Very cool.
That's good to know.
Will, do you have one?
I have a short one. The very last chapter in the book isn't really a chapter in the traditional sense. It really serves as more of an epilogue that shows our two heroes and the wonderful life that they're going to have together. And I thought the scene where they were essentially looking for rooms to rent, where they're going to end up setting up shop for Jack's business, I thought it was particularly adorable because they get into this very coupley argument about where the bedroom is going to be.
I love that one.
Jack insists that the bedroom is on the first floor. That way Oliver doesn't have to climb stairs. And Oliver is like, no, I can handle it. And Jack is very insistent. And at one point he says, I have every intention of being in this house when I'm 40 and also when I'm 50 and until I draw my last breath because I'm never moving again. So we better get a house with a bedchamber on the ground floor. And that's final. And that was how Oliver learned that Jack planned on the two of them living together for the rest of their lives. Which would be, in most romances, the perfect, ending line, but the scene continues a little bit more after that. But I thought that was just really adorable.
Yes.
And really,
I
really
love
cute.
that. I love that line too.
Yeah, and indicative of the kind of banter and relationship that these two have.
Yes.
Kelsey, you want to go next?
I do, because on that note, my quote is from their carriage journey where Oliver is just chit-chatting away because he notices Jack is very uncomfortable with the movement. And so he just starts chitter-chattering, and Jack's observation on that. So it says, he talked as if under a spell in the sort of fairy story you told to only the naughtiest of children, the sad tale of a child who couldn't hold his tongue and was subsequently put under a witch's hex to the effect that the brat could never stop talking unless he wanted his tongue to shrivel and fall off. Except in this case, Rivington produced easy chatter with the same effortless composure with which he did everything else.
Aww. Very cute. I just loved the way that Oliver just knew everything about Jack pretty quickly. Once most of the cards were on the table, Oliver really was just like you guys said, he was like, "Oh, you're trying to push me away. How cute." So my quote is just a little snippet of Kat's writing that I really liked. She's got a really cool style and humor that I think will continue to develop as she writes more books. I think this for her first book, like, awesome. Yes. And I think that this just kind of shows it. So it's during their fight together when they're having their little moment, and it starts like this. A brute of a man Jack recognized from the old days in St. Giles landed a punch on Jack's jaw and sent the banister post clattering out of reach. Rivington cudgeled that man too. Jack was dangerously close to being impressed with Rivington, but he supposed he'd get over it. So I just loved that. And we shared a bunch of other quotes throughout our synopsis that I really loved too. I was really impressed. So super fun. And moving on to our next rating that we talk about, which is our steaminess rating and our encounter counter. So this actually this is episode, what is this, 18 for us?
Yes.
And this is so far holding the record for the most encounters in any book we've read, with a total of what I'm calling 6.5, because there was one that like wasn't graphic. So we consider an encounter anything that's below the belt. And there was one that was like, they had a great night and then they woke up. And I was like, 0.5? I don't know. So I thought this book was hot. I thought these guys had so much chemistry. It was really hot. I loved it.
Liking it to our tea metaphors, I thought this was a cup you had to blow on a few times before you could drink it, because it was pretty dang hot up there. So you had to just be like, I want to drink this right now, but I kind of gotta blow on it a few times first.
I thought Kat did such a good job of making it more intimate each time.
Yes.
They were together. It went from, I hate you and I'm going to get off with you, to this is becoming, we're now making love with each other instead of just getting off. And
yes.
I love that kind of progression. And yeah, I'll go with you. It was hot.
Yes.
Indeed. Yes.
Indeed.
Definitely.
So we also always talk about, we have our, what we call our feminist recap, which especially a lot with romance novels in general, the conception is that they are not supportive, right? That they actually are kind of detrimental to the way that we look at relationships. And so we wholeheartedly disagree, although occasionally we run into books that we think maybe have something that today we consider a little bit more problematic, or we wish it wasn't that way. So we like to talk about that. So we're talking intersectional feminism here. And I thought this book was obviously a wholehearted supporter. We usually say supporter, neutral, or offender. And I don't think everyone's nodding. So I think we're all in agreement. This book is a super supporter.
I thought this was a supporter on many levels, even on just a pure feminist level, because Jack's whole thing is he doesn't take men clients. He only takes females because they're the ones who need his help the most in some cases.
Well, he does take males. He just won't take gentlemen. So people who need his help, right? So
yes. But that's why I say supporter.
Yeah, exactly. Screw those privileged white dudes.
Exactly.
Any book that says screw the privileged white dudes is probably a feminist supporter.
Yeah. And I really like Sarah, because Sarah's not having any of it.
No, she isn't.
You know?
Great. I love her. She eyes him askance. She's like, I'm not going to throw you out, but I'm not going to tell you you're fantastic either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And she tells him to take care of his own problems and that she's not going to just do everything for him. So, I think that that's great as well. Now, when we're talking about gay romance, is there another thing we should be looking out for, or something in particular that any, pitfalls or tropes that authors could fall into that we would maybe be remiss without discussing?
Within the context of historical romance, I think that we've already touched on the difficulties an author might have of creating a plausible happily ever after when, historically speaking, life was so incredibly difficult for people on the LGBTQ spectrum. That being said, I think this particular book illustrates feminism, and I think for historical authors, they might want to go down the path of examining or illustrating the dire circumstances some of the people like Oliver or Jack might have experienced in those times. While it's true that things could have been incredibly difficult for them, it's also the truth that they could have wonderful lives, if they choose to live them that way. And how you speak, how they have to live, like maybe possibly with one foot in the closet, is sort of a fact of their lives within a historical context. But I don't think that diminishes their love or their happily ever after.
Mm-hmm. I would totally agree with that. I think the things that would turn me off pretty much in any romance, whether it turned up in historical or elsewhere, is if you're really going to play to a tired gay stereotype, just like the flaming queer, if you will. There's a place for that, but if you're going to use it well and don't have it there for comic relief or, something else like that. I think be respectful to the characters and to the times that you're writing for. And I think you'll win me over at that point.
I think that makes sense. I recently saw some people discussing the governess trope, right? Where that power imbalance of a servant and someone that can be just really tricky to navigate. And so a lot of people aren't writing that in historicals as much anymore, but those who are doing it in a really unique new way that, obviously is kind of towing that line and not taking this and making something better out of it. So I think that makes sense to my brain too, that there can be things you can do, but you, especially today, sometimes you have to do it a little differently and do it right.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you guys a question about historical romance? When I started reading gay historicals, something that struck me is that even the smallest things can carry so much more meaning, especially within a historical context. Just like, the slightest glance or like the touch of a hand, it means so much more.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think that the sense of the forbidden that plays out in a gay love story is also present in most male-female historical romances as well. Whether it's, whether you're talking about class differences or what have you, there's always a sense of forbidden that's being explored in historical. Am I wrong on that, or?
No, you're 100% correct. So the idea is, and I think that's why Zoe and I personally really like the Regency period as well as getting into the Victorian period, is there was such a separation of men and female in their lives. And the idea that women were lifted on this pedestal and they had to be pure and they had to be like covered at all times because you didn't want to be seen as being unpure. You didn't want to be seen as a flirtatious lady because that could have dire social consequences. So the idea of that touch of the hand, like men weren't supposed to touch women, and women were supposed to wear gloves all the time. So the bare skin to bare skin had so much more meaning in that sense of you weren't necessarily supposed to touch a man with bare skin. A woman and a man weren't necessarily supposed to see each other naked, even in an intimate act. It was done in such secrecy and such shame because there was so much shame for female sexuality. So, that kind of plays into these historical romances. And in some ways, too, we've talked about it when we spoke to Maya Rodale. Like, she talked about the idea of these books were allowing females to really discover their sexuality. So the idea of having that rakish man, push them a little bit so then they could suddenly be like a sexual being and really like embrace it and thrive in it and not be ashamed of it. So I don't know if that answers your question a little bit, but those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about that time period. It's like far enough away that it feels almost magical and almost like another land, but close enough that you know the constructs without having to be told what they are. And it also feels like a little bit magical, but a little bit real life. So you can kind of put yourself there. And like you said, yeah, there is a lot of forbidden. And I think that also maybe makes it I shouldn't say easy, but a little easier to write about, because you're right. Like the touch of a hand can mean so much. So it's just different. And I admit I have read a whole one contemporary ever. So, yeah, I know. So I don't even know how people do it in today's world. I'm like, well, what, that they text each other? Are they sexting? They're probably sexting. I'm sure there's lots of sexting. But like, I can't imagine how the buildup has got to be so different. I actually just got my 19-year-old sister her first romance for Christmas, and she's very different than me. And I really thought long and hard about what I should get her, but I was like, I really want her to experience this. I think there's a lot to be learned from romance, and what would be the right one for her. And I ended up choosing Hello Stranger by Lisa Kleypas, which is the main character is inspired by Elizabeth Garrett, the first woman doctor in England. Anyhow, the point is, she's a woman doctor. I thought, okay, my scientist sister is going to like this a little bit more than just like a governess or a duchess or something. So it's a fantastic book. But the point being that she was like, I just really wasn't. She's like, I really liked it, but I just couldn't believe that they fell in love so quickly. Right. And I was like, well, it was back in the day, like they either fall in love or they're not allowed to touch, like, yeah. I don't really know what to tell you, but no, I did know what to tell her. We had a great conversation about it, but she did say, she was like, but I really wanted to know what was going on with that brother West. And I was like, yes, we got her. We got her. So yeah, I mean, it works for me. I really love that kind of forbidden element that is interwoven with historicals. So I don't know if I answered your question either, but we sure talked for a while about it. So we have one more rating before we get towards our wrap up here, which is our final book rating. So Jeff and Will, if you had to rate this book 1 out of 10, what would you rate this book?
Oh, 100% a 10. 10 plus.
Yeah.
10 plus. I like that.
We, on the Big Gay Fiction podcast, we don't talk about books that we don't absolutely love. And as if it weren't already perfectly obvious, we really love this book a whole lot. I would definitely give it a 10 out of a 10.
Brilliant. What about you, Kelsey?
Well, that's fair, because even though I, had some thoughts about the plot and like my heroes weren't perfect 10s, like I actually rate this book on like an 8.59 scale. So like I actually rate it pretty highly, because overall everything coming together was a really wonderful book, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I love the intimacy I got from it. I loved the spiciness I got from it. I loved the dialogue between the characters. I thought it was overall like very well written. So even though like I had sticking points with it, I really loved it as a whole. So
you basically took the words right out of my mouth, because I feel the same, although maybe I was a little bit nitpickier about the characters and some of the plot. Like I said in the beginning, I kind of wanted to just forgive the, a bit convoluted mystery plot, because what shone through was the good writing and the great characters and the great tension and their love story. And I loved their love story. So I'm going to give this one a 9. I thought it was a fantastic book. Yes. So I can't wait to read more of her books. She's got another one coming out this year. I think it's called Two Rogues Make a Right. And like, what a title. So yeah, I'm super excited to read more of her books and just, I don't know. It's just so great when you find a new author you love. So Jeff and Will, if our readers enjoyed this book, do you have any other recommendations of something that they might enjoy that you'd love to let them know about?
Yes, I actually do.
Yay!
As I mentioned before, I'm not the world's biggest historical romance reader, but after enjoying Cat Sebastian, I searched out some other books, and one of them that I came across was called The Nobleman and the Spy by Bonnie D. and Summer Devon. And as if you couldn't guess from the title, it's about a nobleman and a spy. And they meet. I love this book so very much. It is hot, it's sexy, it's fun. The characters have really interesting chemistry. There's a lot of action in this story because it kind of relies heavily on a bodyguard trope, which I thought was really interesting in a historical context. So I really enjoyed The Nobleman and the Spy.
Very cool. Great recommendation. I'm going to check that one out too.
Yeah, and I'll mention, if you want a little paranormal inside your historical romance.
I'm great with paranormal, especially in a historical context.
So I will recommend Joshua Ian's Darkly Enchanted Romance series. It's Regency with just a hint of like paranormal magic on the sides.
Okay.
Also very hot, but good central love stories too. And I wasn't quite prepared to like the paranormal element as much as I did, because I don't always do paranormal, but Will recommended this book series to me and I picked it up right around Halloween time and was like, that's awesome. And especially to get that kind of, mixed into the historical romance too.
Well, actually, that's a great idea. Maybe we'll read one of those for our Halloween episode.
I was just thinking we like to be on theme when it comes to October.
And
Super
another
cool.
author to keep an eye on this year is Anne Hawley. She's got a historical Regency out there now, also male, and she's been on our show, but she's working on a project that she's been doing where she is taking the story beats of Brokeback Mountain and translating them to Regency romance. To create a male Regency romance that just is based on those story beats that are in that original short story. We can't wait to see how this turns out. It's supposed to come out sometime this year, and excited to see what that looks like.
Absolutely. Now, I recently saw someone talking about how Brokeback Mountain isn't really a true romance because they don't live happily ever after. But is the short story a little bit different than what we saw in film?
Oh, no.
No, it's
okay.
Yeah, it's the movie is a very faithful adaptation of the short story.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
so,
still, we'll see what she comes up with, right?
And it's wildly romantic, and we'll say that she did a whole series of podcasts on a show that she does talking about how they were breaking this down and how she was going to translate it.
Oh, wow.
And there was a lot of back and forth if she was going to actually kill the character as happens in the short story or go for the more happily ever after traditional romance trope. So...
And I don't mean to sound like I'm like, well, if it doesn't have a happily ever after, I'm not one of those people. I just know that some of those people listen. So I think it's best to air that in the open. But I just think like it's really cool to hear about all of the really inspiring projects that people take on and all of the art people are creating. It's just, I love being a part of that kind of like very peripheral sphere and getting to see it and touch it and read it.
That's a great series tagline or something there.
Aw, well, thank you guys so much for the recommendations and for coming on with us today. This has been fantastic. Where can our listeners find you and find out more about you guys?
You can find out more about our show at biggayfictionpodcast.com. We have new episodes every Monday, and we talk about books that we love and authors that we're into. It's a lot of fun, so I hope you come check us out.
You should. I highly recommend it. Like I said earlier, new fan here. So I just want to say thank you again so much for joining us. It's been so fun to talk to you about this book, and we'll have to do it again in the future sometime.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. This was so great, and we loved getting your opinions on this book that we thoroughly enjoyed, and it was so great having some new people to gush over it with.
Oh, thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a good time.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, Zoe, did you just not have so much fun with Jeff and Will?
It was so great to have them on here. It was so great to just have other people on to talk about these books with.
Yes, absolutely. I loved hearing their opinions and their take on thing and their spin, and then having us question our own rating system. But you know what? It's fine. You and I have a system in place, and that's how we're going to do it. But I love talking with them and enjoying this book with them, and I think it just made it all the sweeter for it.
I completely agree, and I'm really, really jazzed to read more Cat Sebastian. I said it before, but I really liked her writing style. I think that she's got a lot of humor, and she kind of just hits all the right notes for me. So I am so happy to have found a new author that I love.
I am really excited as well. I thought that this book was really fantastic, and I am so intrigued by the other characters that I'll definitely be picking up more of her books.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, next week, we are not reading Cat Sebastian.
Nope, we are not. But we are heading back to Pennyroyal Green.
All right. I'm excited. It's been a while.
It has. And surprisingly, if you are not familiar with this series, we're leaving the Everseas and the Redmonds behind. What? How can that be? This is a book series about these families. But no, so we are going to be reading How the Marquess Was Won, and no Redmonds or Everseas take place in it whatsoever.
No.
Well, they're in there, but they're not the main characters.
They are not, but we do get another great cat. So, if you like cats in your books, you're gonna like this one because he's fantastic. So, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you again to Jeff and Will of the Big Gay Fiction Podcast for joining us. And seriously, guys, get out there, start listening. They've got a lot of great recommendations, and they're super fun to listen to. So thanks again, everybody, and join us next time as we read How the Marquess Was Won by Julie Ann Long.
And may all your ever afters end happily.
Tea and Strumpets is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts.
Oliver gets a fantastic blowjob, but doesn't get to repay the flavor because
Flavor?
Jack gets the flavor.
Oh, gosh.
But doesn't get to repay the favor because Jack gets scared with all the feels.
Of course, I just took myself off the page I was on to be able to read more about it. Hang on, sorry.
What were you
No
doing?
worries.
Well, I was on the
All
little
good.
Kindle pop-up page, and then the Kindle pop-up page went away.
Oh, man, Kindle.
Oh, well, I'll just kind of work with it as I go.
New fan here. So I've said a lot of so's, so I'll be editing those out. Anyhow.